So hello, my name's Tony, and I work for Centrify. I work with Darren. And my presentation today is hopefully going to give you a little bit more of an insight as to what we do at Centrify from a zero trust perspective. So I was going to start off with a provocative statement and a few industry statistics to back up that provocative statement, but he stole my slides. So I'm going to fast forward through those, but first, an obligatory joke, because everybody has to have an obligatory joke. And it's security related, so hopefully the nerds in the audience will approve of it. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. Hopefully you can read that. Ta-da. That's funny, wasn't it funny? Come on, laugh, come on. All right, so this is the slide you've already seen. I will emphasize this huge spend on security. So something's broken. That's the provocative statement at the top. Today's security is broken. It's a bold claim. But we kind of based our whole company corporate plan and what we're investing in on that statement. We believe that's true. And it's true in part because of the spend and the continuation of all of these breaches and the multiple times people are getting breached. So, you know, it's kind of like, don't keep repeating the same problems time after time. And today's realities, again, this was another slide that was stolen from me, but the thing that I find the most important is the one at the bottom. And different analysts will come up with different numbers, but they're all above 70%. But this one in particular, 80% of breaches involve privileged credential misuse. This is a little bit misleading because it makes you think that all of the attackers are looking for those privileged accounts first. You know, your root, your administrator, your SA, your Cisco, your Oracle accounts. Not necessarily so. Very often it's easier for them to phish a regular account and then maybe use that to try and get into your system. So the obvious example is the Target breach a number of years ago where somebody's VPN account, their Target VPN account was phished. It was an outsourced HVAC company. And so they get to waltz into the Target network as a legitimate user, using a legitimate account. And that's why the network software, the network controls, didn't see them as an attacker. And they went on for months and months and months and months and to continue their breach. So that is one of the problems. It's not just privileged credentials. Ultimately, they will want to get privileged credentials so they can move laterally and get to the crown jewels. But very often they're using standard accounts in order to get in because that way they don't set off the alarms. So that's a big problem in its own right. Another problem is that hopefully there's no CEOs in the audience because don't listen to them. Right? They get it wrong all the time. We hear from people who've done studies and even from our own customers that the CEOs believe, generally speaking, that malware is the biggest cause of data breaches within their organization, not the abuse of privileged accounts. Now, their C-level below them, their CISOs, their CIOs, they get it. They understand this. But the biggest reason why PAM is not being implemented is because they are unable to convince their CEOs that this is where the real problem lies. And that remains a problem for all of us. As a vendor, you know, we're trying to empower the CIO and the CISO with the ammunition they need to tell the right story. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. So PAM is not being adequately implemented. However, in this current year, Gartner predicts that it will be the second biggest priority for all of our customers. It'll certainly be in the top 10 list. So it is getting there. They are starting to realize this. And if it's not your number one priority, then it will be your number two priority. And if it's not, then pay attention. But nobody is immune. So again, another slide that was stolen from me. I think you had this one, didn't you, Darren? It's an equal opportunity problem. So it's not limited to the government. It's not limited to consumer space. It's not limited to finance or healthcare. It is everywhere. It's an equal opportunity player. So it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're going to have this problem wherever you go. All right, so enough of that. So legacy PAM is not enough. So this is kind of the premise that we come from. Zero trust privilege. So Darren, I thought he was going to go a lot earlier, so I was going to summarize his key points. And I'll do it again anyway as a reinforcement because I don't know about you, but zero trust is one of those nebulous concepts that it's hard to really get your head around and understand what it is. And sometimes you need to be told the same thing in 10 different ways before one of them clicks. So let's talk about in a slightly different way. First of all, it is a framework. It is not a product. It's a framework, right? It's up to the vendors to implement products that correspond to that framework, okay? Now, what we deal with at Centrify is a subset of Zero Trust. So Zero Trust has lots of different domains. We deal with Zero Trust privilege. And what that is privileged access management in a Zero Trust dress. And privileged access management's been around for a long time. It's essentially managing access to servers and network devices by sysadmins. It's controlling who can get a hold of those administrator accounts, those root accounts, those Cisco accounts, and so on, and really lock them down. That's what privileged access management is, okay? Zero Trust privilege is taking the legacy PAM controls that you've had for years on premises and applying those to the cloud, to the hybrid world that you're all now venturing into, and also flipping the equation on its head. So it's not just vaulting. It's not just sticking administrator accounts in a vault, sticking root accounts in a vault, sticking Cisco and SA and other accounts in a vault. It's going beyond the vault, because a vault's not enough. Zero Trust privilege means having to add other elements to the equation, like privilege elevation, okay? And also giving people nearly zero privilege, almost zero. There's no such thing as zero, but almost zero, because you've got to log in, right? So once you're in, you only get the privileges you need to do your job when you need to do your job. So that's the whole concept behind that. So there are PAM vendors like Centrify who are taking these Zero Trust frameworks and trying to build products that implement that and that allow you to move from an old legacy on-premises PAM model to one that will work now when your resources are both on-premises and in the cloud. Okay, so there are products that do this today. So here's another way of looking at that, which is one of our wonderful architecture slides. So legacy PAM, we could broadly define as solving these types of problems. So for system administrators, for developers that need to access servers like Windows and Linux or network devices, okay? We're talking about humans here, human beings, interactive sessions to these types of infrastructure services, including databases and network devices, but using shared privileged accounts. Root administrator, right? That's the old day. That's what used to be the case. But now, with cloud-ready Zero Trust privilege, we're trying to expand that to solve other use cases that involve the cloud, that involve big data. So if you've got big data farms with hundreds or thousands of nodes in various clusters and hundreds of thousands of services all trying to talk to each other to solve particular big data analytics problems, they all need to authenticate to each other. You've got a problem there, right? They all need accounts, they all need privileges. So that's a little bit different to the types of applications and service-based interactions you had purely on premises. This is at a bigger scale. It's a bigger problem. DevOps is another one. So again, at scale, it's all about automation. Instead of embedding credentials in your code, you want to be able to get those credentials in a different way that is more secure. Right? Real-time pulling from a vault, for example, having it in memory, and then when the application quits, it's gone away. There's nothing there for an attacker to sniff on a disk, those types of things. Okay? And even further, we've got customers venturing into containers and microservices. Right? So it's somewhat similar to the problem that we've already had, except again, it's at scale. So instead of one application that was a monolithic thing that you built that runs on a Windows server in your data center, that same application may now be composed of hundreds, if not thousands, of microservices running in multiple containers in the cloud. They all have to talk to each other, container to container, microservice to microservice, application to application. And all of that requires authentication. It all requires an account, some kind of credential that allows that microservice to do its job. You've got to manage that. Those problems you never had on premises. So the stakes have changed. Okay? So this is what we're trying to solve now. We still need to solve the legacy problem. We will still have humans interacting with our infrastructure. So that doesn't go away, right? We'll still have machines that they need to log into, even though it's maybe less so in the cloud. If the machine goes wrong, kill it, fire up a new one. But most of our customers are saying we still want to have the ability to log in as a system admin to our Linux and our Windows instances. That's not going away. Services and APIs. But now it's no longer shared accounts. We don't want to give people shared accounts. We don't want to have IT with a list of shared account passwords written on a whiteboard that they can use 24 hours a day. Instead, we want a different model. We want to have them log in as themselves. Why? Because there's individual accountability. If I log in as Tony, then every audit trail I have will say Tony did this. If I log in as root, it could be 15, 20, 50 administrators that could potentially have done that. Okay, you don't really know. So if you log in as yourself with minimum rights and you use a least privilege model, then you elevate privilege only when necessary. So if you were to look at a kind of a graph of risk over time, if you log in as root or administrator, then if you've got risk going up this way, across the top there over 12 hours, it's high risk because that account is being used and exposed. It's not protected. But if you log in as yourself, and let's say you only do 3 privileged tasks during your 8-hour period, 20 minutes each, an hour in total. For that hour, during each of those 3 elevations, yeah, you're using highly privileged account, or you're using privileges that are higher than normal. But for the rest of the time, 80% of the time, you're back down to a low level of privilege. So from an attack surface perspective and an overall risk posture, you are way more secure because you're using low privileged accounts for the majority of your time on those systems. So that's another element of zero trust privilege. MFA everywhere is a good one. We have a lot of our competitors, they like to use MFA. MFA is great, extra assurance. Yeah, it is, it's brilliant. It's really, really good. But not just on login to a vault, right? It shouldn't stop there. So if I'm a sysadmin and I log into a vault, sure, maybe I get prompted for MFA. That's good. They're trying to assure my identity, okay? But then once I'm logged in, I might want to do something like checking out the root password in an emergency break glass scenario. Maybe I should be prompted for MFA there if the conditions warrant it, okay? Maybe I'm establishing a secure remote login to a Windows server from the vault. So I'm logged into the vault and I say I want to log in as administrator to that server. Shouldn't I possibly be prompted for MFA there as well? Okay. What if I bypass the vault altogether? Right? What if I'm a rogue insider? Or maybe a good insider, but I'm tired of using the vault that they've just deployed. So I'll use it the first time, and I'll check out the root password, and then I'll log into this Linux box. Then I'll create a backdoor SSH key. And then I'll just log in directly from now on, bypassing the vault. Okay. So why wouldn't we have MFA at login at the server level as well, just in case that type of scenario happens, right? Because if I'm an attacker, I'm not going to say, oh, look, there's a vault. I'd better log into the vault first before I try and attack these other systems. I'm going to want to move laterally throughout the network. You will bypass the vault. So you need to have these controls, MFA and otherwise, at the server login as well. And then once you're logged into the server, if you follow this least privilege model where you're not logged in as root, you're logged in as yourself, and you want to do something like restarting the web server or installing a piece of software, you elevate privilege just for that task. Maybe we should prompt for MFA there as well, potentially. That's what we mean by MFA everywhere. So in the new world, you want to have the ability of reducing your risk by potentially applying MFA at every point of access, whether it's privilege elevation or checking out a password or logging into the vault, not just at vault login. And that's a new thing as well. All right. So, are we all having fun yet? Yeah? All right. So, our approach, and again, zero trust and zero trust privilege is not a product. It's a framework, but this is how we've implemented our solutions. This is the model that we built to adhere to zero trust. So the first blob is verify who. We want to know who it is that's knocking on the door. And it could be a human user, or it could be a service or an application or an API. But we want to be able to verify who this is. Do we know this thing? Is it legitimate? So That might involve MFA, as I just discussed, right? It may involve, ideally, we would want to give all of our users, especially our administrators, because we're talking privileged access management here, one single identity. So instead of having multiple identities across all of their Linux and Windows servers, we give them one identity, let's say an Active Directory, and they use that to log in to the Linux boxes. So we consolidate identities. We get rid of all these silos, all the Etsy password stuff, where you've got an account there and you can't remember what it is and you've got another one somewhere else. You collapse all of those down. And so verifying who means you've got one legitimate address that you're verifying, okay? And you're using MFA to better assure their identity. And you're using MFA in collaboration with the second thing, which is contextualizing the request. So MFA is good, but if it's always on, that gets a little tedious. You want to switch it on based on context. Context might be, we're going to prompt for MFA if it's outside of normal business hours, or if the user is coming from a location that we don't like or that we don't trust, if they're not on the corporate network, if it's 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, or if it's a machine, if it's a device that we don't trust. So based on context, we can say, it's okay, low risk, we'll let them in. Or maybe a medium risk, we'll prompt them for a second factor. Or maybe the risk is so high based on those contextual parameters that we're just going to deny them altogether. But the point here is that it's not binary, it's not always on or always off, it's based on context. So that's an important element. Then the third thing is securing the admin environment. This kind of goes to what Microsoft calls a clean source approach. So in essence, you've got users and you've got resources, and the users want to access the resources. And in the PAM world, it's a sysadmin wants to log into a server. Okay? The problem is, if that sysadmin's laptop has viruses or malware, is unclean in some way, there's a good chance that that's going to spread to the server. So what our customers want to do is isolate their infrastructure from the sources that the admins are using to log in. And remember, these admins may be third parties. They may be outsourced IT, and you may not have any control over those devices. So as an outsourced IT guy, I've just been surfing the web. I've been phished. I've got malware. And then I waltz in through a VPN and physically attach to your network, and now you run the risk of whatever diseases I have on my laptop spreading to your infrastructure. So we want to secure the admin environment. Ideally, we do it without a VPN. So through the Vault, for example, we would have outsourced IT log into the Vault and do a secure remote connection to the endpoint if they have the roles and rights to do that, but without a VPN. So that way they're not network attached. That way your IT doesn't have to manage what antivirus and anti-malware software they have. They don't need NAC. It's through a browser-based session. So that's one way that we can secure the admin environment. And then finally, this is the thing that all of our customers have finally recognized. They used to define privileged access management as equaling a vault on premises. PAM equals vault equals on premises. And it's not the case. The vault is not enough. If they're interested in reducing their attack surface, you need a combination of the vault and privilege elevation. So granting least privilege is a critical component. And I mentioned that a few times. So that's allowing people to log in as themselves so they're fully accountable, but they only have the rights and the roles to elevate privilege to do certain tasks that's specific to their job function. And you can wrap other controls around that, like access requests. So you could say, okay, this person can request access to do this, to run this application, and it gets approved by somebody, or maybe it's tied to a trouble ticket in ServiceNow, for example. But either way, there's a workflow, and they'll get approved, and that will get recorded, or they won't get approved. So it's an extra control around the use of elevated privileges. And then, of course, around the outside, you've got to audit everything, right? And ideally, you want session recordings. You want a visual recording of activity, whether it's through the vault or directly on the server. Because remember, you can bypass the vault if you're clever. So on the server, you want host-level session recording, or the option of doing that, in addition to doing it at the vault level if you're initiating connections through the vault. Okay? And the final thing is adaptive control. So that's kind of like contextualizing the request that we have here. But when we talk about contextualizing the request, it's kind of like more of the old school, where it's all policy-driven. So you have to write a policy to do that. So you might say, if the time of day is between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., then prompt for MFA. Or if this is a machine we've never seen, prompt for MFA. So you're having to manage policies, and they're static. Now what this does is it brings an element of artificial intelligence into the equation. So what it allows you to do is, as a systems admin, my behavior over a period of time would be technically observed. What do I do routinely as a sysadmin? My behavior will be modeled and a baseline established. So now when I come to do something, elevate privilege or check out a password, then the system can say, is this within the normal behavior of Tony? And then maybe it do a risk score. So low risk, he does this all the time. Let him in. Medium risk, maybe we'll prompt for MFA. High risk, we'll deny him access. But instead of having to manage static policies, which, as Darren said, we're always going to be behind the curve because the attackers are always one step ahead of us, okay? You may not have written a policy in your engine that accounts for a particular attack method or a behavior of a user. But by having a behavioral analytics that watches what you do and says, ooh, that looks dodgy, it can automatically react to that. Now, some vendors do have analytics, but it's mostly detective. It's after the fact. It looks through logs and says, ooh, that you may want to go back and look at that. You want something that's tied to the access controls in real time. So as I knock on the door and say, let me into the vault, or give me that, let me check out that root password, it's at that point in time that your access control can say yes or no based on a feed from your analytics engine. That is the ideal. Okay. So these are the elements of zero trust privilege that we've come up with. Now, you say, well, that's great, but what about implementing this stuff? How am I doing for time, by the way? Am I okay? Okay. So it's a big elephant, right? So a bite at a time would be ideal. So there's probably multiple ways of skinning the cat. This is one way. This is a kind of a best practice that we've formulated over, we've been doing this kind of zero trusty stuff for about 2.5 years now. So this is what we've come up with. So it's really 3 phases that we, and again, your maturity and your own projects may vary. But the first thing might be kind of vault-centric. So vaults are great. They have their place, but they're not the end of the world, right? They're not the be-all and end-all. But as an initial state, discover the systems, the network devices, the privileged accounts, the service accounts. Discover all of those, get them inside a vault, or at least have visibility into them, okay? You can't manage what you don't know. So discover them and vault them. Now, while you're there, you can be looking at local accounts. You can be saying, well, okay, we want to vault these local accounts and only use them in emergency break glass situations, which means that you're kind of then starting to subscribe to the least access and privilege model, right? So instead of 80% of the time your IT admin's coming in and at 9 o'clock in the morning, they check out the root password from the vault and then they just stay logged in as root all day. That's not a best practice. Only use that in emergencies, 10% or less of the time. Every other time, it's least access with privilege elevation. Log in as yourself, elevate privilege when you need to. And you may be following, for example, Microsoft best practice for -A accounts. Is anybody familiar with -A accounts? Nobody? Good old Microsoft. It's working. But anyway, we do have a lot of customers that use -A accounts. What that means is their systems admins get 2 accounts instead of 1. Okay? And that's because if they have 1 account, it's probably the account on their business card that they hand out to everybody they meet. So if anybody wants to phish them, there's the account. I've already got a head start, right? So they use that to do everyday stuff, but they have another account called an alternate or a -A account, because in the early days it would be tony.goulding-a for admin or -admin@centrify.com. That's the one that would have more privileges. A lot of customers actually do that. A lot of customers do that. So you want to have the ability of discovering those and vaulting them away as well. And this is where you get into the just-in-time access. And you get the ability to have access request and approval workflow tied around this stuff. So just because I have the role in my job function that says I'm allowed to restart the web server on this Linux box or edit the sudo as file, doesn't mean I should. So maybe you want to switch on approval access request and approval for that. So now I have to request it with some justification, and maybe there's a help desk ticket number that I'm following, and then it goes to my manager and I say, oh, look, oh, help desk, oh, yeah. Bingo. You've got 10 minutes. Time boxing, not permanent rights, only for a duration of time, after which that right and that role gets automatically deprovisioned. Okay. NIST Assurance Level 2, we have a lot of customers, not just in the government, also in commercial side, who subscribe to the NIST best practices. Assurance Level 2 is a set of second factors. NIST Assurance Level 3, which is on the next slide, is where we then get into more advanced topics, more maturity, maybe a little more esoteric. NIST Assurance Level 3 is smart card, right? We believe every administrator should be using maybe a YubiKey, a USB dongle, but something physical that corresponds with the NIST Assurance Level 3 that says you need to have something physical with a pin that is under your control. But then in the third level is we do all of those more advanced things like the behavioral analytics, which you don't need to start off with, but it could be a good kind of maturity step. In addition to maybe vaulting secrets, because initially we're really just talking about discovering and vaulting passwords, right? Passwords suck. So maybe we want to have more advanced authentication mechanisms that the vault supports. So if I have a service or I'm building an application, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to write this code to use a password that's vaulted in the password vault, maybe I use an OAuth token instead, or a SAML token, or a Kerberos ticket. So your solution needs to have the ability to act as an authentication provider as well, and be able to satisfy those kinds of capabilities, including vaulting of secrets, not just passwords, like configuration parameters for DevOps, or URLs, or something that might be considered sensitive if it was discovered in code. But it doesn't have to be it could be an SSH key, right? An AWS access key, something. So you'd be doing all of those things as well. So this is a nice kind of three-phase approach. And again, some people will say, no, I want to do that first. It's important to me. But at least it gives you a sense of how you can build over time in a phased approach and get risk reduction, attack surface reduction, and more capabilities from a privileged access management perspective. This is my token blank screen. I have no idea why it's blank. Oh, that's why. Okay. So this is another example of where Zero Trust has caused us to architect our solution in a slightly different way that legacy on-premises PAM solutions just cannot satisfy. So we're talking about, excuse me, let's say in general just a vault, a password vault, where we store passwords and secrets. We want to give access to various constituents. And in the new kind of hybrid cloud model, there are more constituents. But ostensibly, we've got systems admins or outsourced IT or third-party human users that need to access the vault directly through a UI. Great. That should be a SaaS service. If it's in the cloud, anybody can access it from anywhere. You can still control who gets in. You've still got MFA, you've still got identity assurance, and you can control what they do in the vault. But if you have a SaaS vault, they can access it from anywhere. And for outsourced IT, for example, it gives them an ideal on-ramp into your world without giving them a VPN connection. So then you may say, well, now I've got stuff on premises, but I'm venturing to the cloud. So over there in Google Cloud, I want to stand up some Linux boxes or Windows boxes or whatever it happens to be and start building out some applications out there in the cloud. And some of these applications may want to talk to the vault to fetch passwords or secrets or OAuth tokens, whatever it happens to be. And the other way around, I think I've got a laser pointer on here, is this person may want to do a remote login to the server interactively for the purposes of installing software or debugging code or whatever it happens. So it's kind of a two-way street. And what you don't want to do is have to replicate that entire vault inside this VPC, because by definition, these VPCs are fairly self-contained. You don't want to open them up and have like lots of vault-to-vault kind of synchronization traffic. So what we've done is we've built this lightweight connector that has an AD proxy, so it can talk to AD if it happens to be here. It has an SSH proxy, so it can do SSH to a Linux box or RDP to a Windows box, and other capabilities as well. But it's lightweight. It's just a little Windows service. So in order to achieve those bidirectional goals, you don't have to replicate the vault. The Vault scales elastically because it's in AWS as a SaaS service. So your Vault doesn't need to be replicated everywhere you go. And if it gets even more complex, now you're going into Azure and you've got multiple VPCs. And these are containers maybe that share parts of an application. And this application needs to access the Vault to get authentication to talk to this one. And this one needs authentication to talk to this one in a different infrastructure as a service provider. They all need to access the Vault. And in the legacy world of PAM, you would have to replicate that Vault everywhere. But with this type of architecture, distributed gateway architecture, a lightweight Windows service gives you that ability. And these things have a persistent outbound connection to the Vault, not an inbound connection. So you don't have to poke all these holes in your firewall. Okay? So it's lean and mean. And of course it grows from there. So this is an architecture that we've built over the last 3 years to solve these types of problems. One other problem that this solves is that ostensibly PAM vendors use AD as a means of authenticating people into their Linux boxes, let's say. Okay? We do the same thing. AD bridging is what it's called. Problem is, if you have this type of environment, in order to, and let's say somewhere off here is your enterprise with AD, you're going to have to replicate AD in all of these environments so that these servers can authenticate the users against AD. So if I hit this server and say, I'm tony.goulding@centrify.com, my AD account, log me in, this server needs to say, I need to talk to AD in order to verify that account. So you've got to replicate your AD infrastructure here. And here, and here, and here, and here. Okay? So with this cloud infrastructure that we created, we have the ability of, instead of joining this server or this server or this server to AD in the corporate enterprise, we can join that to our Centrify cloud-based Vault. And that thing talks down to AD on premises. So it now acts as an identity broker. So you can authenticate your administrators into those boxes without replicating AD into those VPCs. And that is another use case that never existed when it was purely legacy PAM on premises that we have had to consider for the new cloud-based hybrid models. And it all revolves around zero trust. So zero trust is at the core, and then these use cases build around it. So hopefully that makes sense. Am I okay? Okay. So finally, these are the products, because we have to have an obligatory Centrify product slide, that implement all of that. And I'm not going to dwell on this. We have the privileged access service, which is essentially the Vault. And there's 2 deployment options. So if you really don't like SaaS, you can do it on premises, but we have both. And it's the same code base, okay, which is nice. Then there's the authentication service, which really focuses mostly on the MFA everywhere. You don't have to do MFA everywhere. It's not an absolute requirement. If it is, then that's the authentication services. Privilege elevation service is logging in as yourself and elevating Windows or Linux on an as-needed basis. Time box duration only for the duration of the execution of that application. And then finally, auditing and monitoring service, well, not finally, but that's the session recording, visual playback of privileged activities, either through the Vault or ideally on the host, in case the Vault is bypassed. And then the threat analytics service. So that's kind of your more advanced behavioral-based black magic that no one understands, but it does the job. Okay. So I think that's my last slide, and it certainly is.